The soldiers set up an ambush on the road, firing at the enemy reinforcements who were coming to rescue their comrades in the fighting. In the nearby city, kamikaze drones saw the enemy tanks firing inside the villages and flew in to stop their actions. Ukrainian soldiers kept advancing inside Kursk, trying to capture as many cities as possible. While the Russians were reorganizing their defenses, they brought in artillery to support this advance, but Russian drones started coming down against this equipment. It was the third week of Kiev's troops being present on Russian territory, and now their challenge was not just the poorly trained conscripts. The invasion of Kursk in August 2024 by the armed forces of Ukraine was an act used by Kyiv, one that changed the game of war, testing Putin's power. The objectives declared by Zelensky were not clear at all, and much was questioned about the resources spent on an act like this. Whatever the outcome, the Russian president had a big problem on his hands. Putin drew several lines on his rough maps that Ukraine or its Western supporters should not cross, with the United States and Germany being deeply reluctant and afraid of escalation. Ukraine was left with its hands tied, as it could do little without its allies providing equipment and ammunition. This reluctance led Zelensky and Commander Oleksandr Syrsky to hold meetings only between the two of them. None of the allies had been informed, according to some sources, out of fear that information might leak or that they would try to stop the plans. The troops were then gradually moved to the border between the Ukrainian Oblast of Sumy and the Russian Oblast of Kursk. They said it was to prevent Russian incursions and sabotage groups in the region. Also based on the rumor that the Kremlin would try a new one, they did it in Kharkiv. Apparently, the Russian commanders were warned, but they ignored it. The Ukrainian soldiers and sergeants only found out what would happen shortly before, and even then, they laughed, thinking it was a joke. When the first border post was obliterated and the columns marched, smiles disappeared from the faces of both Ukrainians and Russians. The world watched in shock as Russia was invaded and waited for Putin's reaction. There was silence, bluster, and a step back to draw a new line, further back from those that represented the Russian borders. The Russians, with their conscripts and Chechens at the border, couldn't stop anyone. The advance was rapid. Putin's escalation was straightforward, shown by one fact. In a meeting, the governor of Kursk tried to explain how far the Ukrainians had advanced. He was cut off by the president, and everything continued as if a natural disaster or a minor event was being discussed. One of the Ministry of Defense's communication channels, Russian Defense, started saying that the Ukrainians were fleeing Kursk in a hurry. On August 25th, the same official channel stated that they had already killed almost 6,000 Ukrainians and destroyed more than 700 enemy pieces of equipment. Even with all this carnage being publicized, the Kremlin's armed forces kept losing territory in Kursk. Russia had one of the largest armed forces in the world, and now it had a problem on its own territory. With more than 120,000 people displaced from their homes, it was difficult to clarify how many reinforcements had been sent to Kursk, but the main names so far were the 488th Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 6th Combined Arms Army and the 810th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, the 155th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade. It also appeared, including with an infamous video, where one of its members showed the severed head of a Ukrainian hanging as a sign of threat. These last-mentioned troops, in fact, were advancing in southern Donetsk. Their reserves were sent to support the chaotic and stalled invasion of Kharkiv, and now Putin's red lines were not crossed with enough force to warrant a stronger retaliation in Kursk, so much so that most of his efforts continued in Donetsk, aiming for territorial gains in positions like Toretsk and Ivanivka. Of course, in the midst of all this, there were also the Chechens from the Akhma battalion. These special forces became infamous for fleeing in the early days and for being blamed for the capture of conscripts. The Russians themselves said this. A video also became famous showing one of them fiercely fighting a door to capture some cell phones as prisoners of war. The Russian channels identified him as Yusuf Abdulvadilov, the leader of the Chechens in Kursk. Aladnov stated that the battles in the region would last about 2 to 3 months and the special operation would not last much longer either. In the middle of his speeches, he said that the conscripts should go to the front because even at 18 years old and poorly trained, they were employees of the Ministry of Defense. This drew some anger from certain groups, especially some concerned parents. Meanwhile, Putin made a visit to Chechnya, where he met with Ramzan Kadyrov, the current leader of the republic. There were reasons for the top leader of Russia to go there in 2023. Kadyrov stated that he has sent more than 26,000 fighters to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, including 12,000 volunteers, and that, at the time, 7,000 of them were actively fighting. During the visit, Russian President Kadyrov visited the grave of Ramzan's father, Akhmat Kadyrov, who, with the outbreak of the Second Chechen War, switched sides, offering his services to the Russian government and later became the president of the Chechen Republic. On his first visit in 13 years, Putin also watched a bit of Ramzan's son, Kadyrov, shooting at some targets, but apparently he wasn't there to see him firing with 2 golden machine guns. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians expanded their territory in Kursk. The concern about them getting closer and closer to the nuclear plant made the Russians send Orthodox church priests with their icons to the site. Some of these actions led many to think that Putin was bothered by Kursk, but his focus was on Donetsk, and during the offensive, the Russians in Kursk began to create very good trenches, prepared to halt the Ukrainian advance. These would allow for a defense system that would be difficult for the Ukrainians to overcome, even though they were quite far from the front line. And if the Ukrainians reached them, it would be a major failure of the first lines. The problem would be having enough troops to drive out the invaders. If they intended to stay longer, the problem would be the analysts. A total of 50,000 men would be needed to drive the invaders out of Kursk. In that case, it wouldn't help to do as the suggestion of a man dressed as a soldier who cursed the civilians of Kursk for not having resisted the Ukrainians. Soon after, it was learned that he was not a soldier, but made money from burying those who had fallen in combat. Putin had one of the largest armed forces in the world at his disposal and the means to expel the Ukrainians. But no resource in the world is infinite, and he would have to make drastic choices. Time to talk about Ukraine's problems. First, Kiev would have to deal with the fact that Belarus sent its troops to the border, including the Wagner Group soldiers, who went there after their rebellion. A Ukrainian minister warned the Belarusian authorities not to make tragic mistakes for their country under pressure from Moscow. The truth is that, even though Minsk's armed forces are less prepared, having another front created might be too much for Ukraine. If the Russians had important decisions to make, the Ukrainians would also have to, and Zelensky and Syrskyi would need to know how to deal with Donetsk, where they were only losing territory. It was said that 1,000 troops were used in Kursk, many of them elite, names like 22nd Brigade, mechanized by some of the most talked about. There's no need to talk again about Ukraine's problem. nor about the times when their allies failed to provide ammunition and equipment, ruining strategies and defenses. As they expanded their territory in Kursk, the Ukrainians would need to know how to defend what they had conquered and how to prepare for it. In the first weeks, it was easy to maintain a supply line for the troops and support with reserves. But how long would the Russians wait before deploying their planes and missiles? To strike these rear positions, the Kremlin's forces were already organizing. In the third week of the invasion, more powerful equipment began wreaking havoc on the columns, and many of the scout groups started being captured and shown in videos. They were tough choices for both sides, with strategies either working or failing, as the rules of the war game changed, driven mad with the only clear goal being to cause more suffering. The Russians targeted the Ukrainian equipment. In Kursk, during the third week of the invasion, there were better prepared troops, with drones flying to intercept enemy tanks along the roads of the Russian oblast. These strikes were combined with artillery fire against the enemies. The surveillance drones were scattered across the skies of Kursk, identifying targets and sending coordinates. The shots from the equipment set Ukrainian vehicles on fire in various positions where the Russian defenses were tested. Kiev's troops had brought their artillery to Kursk, starting to set up their equipment like an M howitzer. The explosion happened in front of them, throwing shrapnel. The artillery started working again shortly after, but was interrupted once more by another drone, which hit the ground, only damaging the howitzer, but detonating the ammunition hidden among the trees. Those drones could ruin the Ukrainian plans. The destruction of a vehicle would already eliminate the movement of at least 5 soldiers who were inside it. Outside, the wounded or killed by the impact, the survivors, whether able to fight or not, became a new concern. Transporting the wounded was difficult and time-consuming, giving time for kamikaze drones to strike those who were there to help, causing even more casualties. The Ukrainian columns kept moving forward, with advance groups supported by armored vehicles and artillery entering the villages. The Russians tried to stop this kind of advance. Their reconnaissance drones quickly called in their attack counterparts. The kamikaze drones descended on the Ukrainian equipment, but these alone weren't enough to stop this kind of advance. Prepared soldiers were necessary. The Ukrainians kept advancing. Grenade launchers cleared the way to positions where the Russians were still holding out. The rifles searched for targets inside the houses abandoned by the citizens of Kursk. Armored vehicles were used to destroy wherever the enemy set up base. When the settlement was considered clear, the soldiers headed to the nearest fortification. Grenades shook the earth and the wood that held the structure together. More explosives kept being thrown, while the Ukrainians made their way through different positions, surrounding Russians whose souls were barely crippled by the war. The place was finished off with an explosion to announce that it would not be used again by the Kremlin. This kind of advance allowed them to reach Martinovka. The troops, inexperienced and unprepared, were still part of the defense. Despite the Russian reinforcements, these soldiers were forced to flee several times. Even with good equipment to use, the Ukrainian drone operators helped identify the areas where their columns needed to pass. The men followed the paths, cleared the mines from the roads so the Avengers could proceed. The Ukrainians were gaining territory inside the cities. In one case, they captured an abandoned Piatenta left behind by the surprise troops. In another position, the paratroopers of the 80th Air Assault Brigade found a P-90, a tank praised by Putin as one of the great Russian war machines. Days later, another one was reportedly found and towed to Ukraine. However, more Russian forces kept arriving in Kursk. In operation for more than 43 years, the Su-25 was developed to provide air support to Soviet ground forces. During this period, the aircraft took part in several conflicts, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In 2024, it flew over Russian skies to defend its own territory, ready to drop high-explosive aerial bombs against the Ukrainian ground advances. The explosives went off in the Russian forests where the enemies tried to find cover. The Ukrainian advances in the east and south of Sudza were significant in some ways, but the Russians detected some of them early on. For example, in Girem, the Ukrainians had encountered Chechens, but troops like the 488 Regiment also provided support, launching their drones against the forces of Kyiv. Even at the beginning of the invasion, the fighting was prolonged, with many armored vehicles lost as they tried to enter the village. Drones dropped explosives on some of the equipment hidden in the forests. The fire set the surrounding forest and also the Ukrainian armored vehicles on fire. The soldiers had to flee from the destruction, leaving behind the lives of friends and many of the vehicles in a village engulfed by smoke and fire. From the beginning up to the third week of the invasion, Hiri became a barrier for the Ukrainians. The war began to destroy the village, and the Russians started experiencing devastation at home and in the fields. Sadness began to hit the civilians harder and harder as they identified their homes destroyed by their own troops or by the invaders, and it would get worse. The northern fighting front from Kursk extended to cities such as Malaya and Lokhnya. Residential buildings where the Russians were hiding were hit by fire from the Marder infantry fighting vehicle of the 95th Air Assault Brigade. The MKV cannon 20mm could fire more than 1,000 rounds per minute. It tore apart the entire structure, shattering the homes of people who, just 20 days earlier, were watching the war on their cell phones. The assault did not allow the capture of Malaya Lokhnya. The Ukrainian forces were stopped by reinforcements, who arrived to help the exhausted troops that were holding out against the attacks. The location was a concern for the Russians as it was less than 50 kilometers from the Kursk nuclear power plant. The Marines of the 810 were there to fight the Ukrainians, even using their drones to hit transport vehicles. The Kiev soldiers from the 95th Brigade also had their drones operating in the area, and they flew into the houses where the Russians were entrenched, blowing up the homes of some men. The equipment of the 810 was hit as they tried to position themselves in the city. The explosions kept chasing the tired soldiers and also the reinforcements that had just arrived, turning Malaya Lokhnya into a contested area. The rifles firing at Russian transports on the roads were one of the Ukrainian strategies to prevent more reinforcements from entering Malaya Lokhnya. One of those vehicles was pushed off the road and was shot at, until finally the threats were contained. The Ukrainians found a man still alive next to the vehicle, covered in blood stains. Since the ambushed Russian didn't have time to warn that he was attacked, Kiev soldiers stayed in the same spot, and their shots flew at more enemies. The noise of war filled the empty road. The Ukrainians approached to find a soldier still alive, but they didn't have time to do anything. Nothing. The Ukrainians approached once again. The music of war ignited on the road. When the danger was eliminated, they returned to check on the new prisoners of war. Malaya Lochnia became a boundary for the Ukrainians until August 26. Another axis of attack was the north towards Kolenyevo. The Mi-28 helicopters took off from their Russians to protect the area from Ukrainian assaults. It was a difficult advance, under attack from missiles and aircraft. On August 14th, the Ukrainians claimed they were already at the edge of the city. The Russians refuted the information and released a video, claiming they were waiting for the enemies. There, the smoke in the sky showed the Russian Air Force fighting against the invaders. First-person view drones filmed Ukrainian tanks firing at Kolenyevo. The soldiers suffered from the gunfire inside the houses, waiting for the kamikaze equipment to explode against the target. To relieve the distress of the men defending the city, Ukrainian drones flew to support the troops. In these advances on their positions, they had to blow up a lot of equipment to clear access to the villages. On the northern front of the fighting, drones from the 80th Assault Brigade hit the Russian mortars. Then they searched for the defense posts where the soldiers were hiding. The hunt was intense, and the explosions filled the air over the field with smoke. The sound of fire against metal was the main instrument in the music of war, which grew louder until it reached the Russian communication and detection positions. After so many battles, the Ukrainian troops entered Kolenyevo, expanding their control around the hunted city, the only dangerous position for the Russian troops. There were still those who were surrounded. After the destruction of the bridges over the Sen River, Putin would have to decide what to do in Kursk. He could send many more troops. He could wait for the Ukrainians to exhaust themselves given Kiev's limited human resources, or make the most drastic decision. He could choose to use in his own country the same tactic of liberating cities that he used in Ukraine. Russia had enough power for that, and the tactic put the Ukrainians at a territorial loss in Donetsk. But it was a difficult decision. Cities like Sutsa and several villages were almost intact with little destruction, and many citizens still moving around the area. The longer the Russian command waited to decide, the more the Ukrainians advanced or established positions within the territory, so much so that they could easily withdraw damaged equipment and call in reserves. This would make an even more intense attack necessary, which would raise monuments in Russia, eternal legacies left by Putin's government. The skeletons of cities scattered across Ukraine showed how those monuments made a man remembered much more than any statue or plaque. It was power, fear, or hatred in the form of gigantic mausoleums built with iron and fire in a nation.